by the end of 2023 if demand crippling recession hits. Seema Shah is chief strategist at Principal Global Investors. She told us she is keeping an eye on oil for hints about a possible recession.
From a global perspective, we have a baseline view that the U.S. is going to go into recession early next year. We think that the recession is going to be somewhat shallow. I know everyone's getting bored of this word, but it's a shallow recession, which is maybe a little bit more prolonged. Now, on the other hand, if you do have the point where oil prices rise to $150, $200 a barrel, well, this is your stagflationary scenario where you not only do you have a very prolonged recession, but you have a very, very deep recession.
And oil prices are lower. ExxonMobil down 4.9% among oil stocks. BP down 5.6%. Chevron down 4.2%. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
Connection lost.
All right, you are listening to Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio. Carol Masser, Tim Stenovic, they are out today, but I am joined by Kriti Gupta in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Paul Sweeney here with Kriti Gupta, looking at a crazy day in the market. Lots of news. We're going to get to it all. Big movements in the markets. We're going to check it with Neil Dutta. He's calling this the recession trade. He's the head of economic research at Renaissance Macro. He'll be coming up, and he's saying flat out, this is the recession trade. Plus, a lot of political turmoil in the UK just breaking in the last hour. We'll have the latest for you on that. And then another great story coming out of Business Week, Bloomberg Business Week, that heist edition that we highlighted last week. Great story here about apparently there's a lottery lawyer out there. So if you win the big lottery, Kriti, apparently there are people who that's their expertise. They focus on that kind of stuff. Apparently, however, there's some bad apples out there, and we got a story on one of them.
I didn't even know you needed a lawyer for that.
Well, you come into all this gajillions of dollars. How do I manage it? What do I do? What are my legal responsibilities? How do I protect myself?
Stuff it under a mattress, right?
I think so. But anyway, we got a lot coming up. Markets are moving. The oil really gets my attention. WTI crude oil below $100 per barrel. Let's bring in Jess Menton, Bloomberg equities reporter. Wild day in the market. I've been on radio all day, and this morning it was really ugly. More than a 1% move down in the market, more than a 2% move down in the S&P. Kind of scratching a little bit of it back, though.
Right, and especially when you're looking at the NASDAQ 100 pairing those losses, it was down as much, almost 2% this morning. And a lot of that also has to do with what we're seeing with the 10-year Treasury yield and what's happening with bond yields and the relationship when you're looking at technology and growth stocks. Typically, when there's a rapid rise in yields, that would make their future cash flows less attractive. So you're seeing some relief there. But again, to your point, when you're talking about what's happening with oil, you're looking at energy, materials, industrial shares, among the biggest decliners in the S&P 500 today. And it's really tied to that. And also what's happening as far as those recessionary concerns you were mentioning. And then obviously potential fears about a global economic slowdown and how that could impact demand for oil. But then on the flip side of that, when you think about the American consumer and what lower oil prices could potentially mean as the translation to gas prices, there is that potential benefit there. But obviously that's not something that we've seen sustained for a while. And the question of how long can oil prices stay below $100 a barrel?
Well, how much of this is also the FX story? Because we also saw, euro-dollar parity was the story this morning on the horizon, 102. The strength in the greenback, the correlation with stock market has been so strong all year long.
Exactly. Anytime we see the dollar pair a bit, we begin to see relief in equities. But then to your point, when you have days like this and you see people flocking toward those safety type trades, including the dollar, then equities are going to get pressured again. So that seems to be another big story today. But again, when it comes to these recessionary concerns, when I'm talking to strategists and traders, they still feel like in order for that to really be the case, we'd have to see another big leg lower in the market. So Bloomberg Intelligence actually prices the S&P 500 at 35.86 as sort of their case if there was going to be a recession scenario. So if we're trading around 37.90 right now in the S&P 500, still would have a ways to go.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like, we had the first quarter of this calendar year was negative GDP. The Atlanta Fed says second quarter going to be a similar type negative number. I was taught that's a recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But, I guess the question now is from a lot of folks is how deep will it be? How long will it be? And to what role will the Fed play in kind of nudging us, into this recession?
Right. And so that's what's going to bring about a lot of these debates once we get that update for the second quarter GDP later this month, because are you going off of 2 consecutive quarters of a contraction, or the National Bureau of Economic Research has a different definition. So they're going by more of kind of a prolonged slump. And by the time they would be able to define something like that, typically markets would bottom. Sam Stovall over at CFR Research has great data about that, and typically sort of on average looking back when that happens. So that'll really create a lot of the debate around that, and especially to your point when it comes to the Atlanta Fed. They've continued, I mean, that number can be a bit volatile, but right now it's around 2.1% contraction for the second quarter. In the last few weeks, it's continued to come down. It was around just under 1%, then it was flat, and then in the last couple of weeks, it's just gotten sharply lower.
You know, it's fascinating that you say it's 2 consecutive quarters of contraction, because that's how I learned it as well. I actually was talking to Mike McKee about this, and he goes, "That's cute. That's not how recession is."
Right. It's funny especially with the econ reporters are great, and they'll throw out the definitions from the National Bureau of Economic Research. So that's what's kind of complicated as far as waiting for that for them to make that call. And it still took them time. If you think back to March 2020, I mean, for them to call, it was much later into that year, maybe actually even into the following year once they actually defined what that was.
Looking at gasoline prices at the pump, unleaded $4.80. That's high, but we peaked a few weeks ago at just over $5. So maybe that's rolling a little bit, and we'll see what happens here. But they always tell me to focus on the refining capacity, because there's no refining capacity. That's what's keeping supplies tight. But it's not just the underlying oil story, but that's a big part of the inflation out there.
Right. And then we'll also have the jobs report on Friday, which will have that key inflation component when we're looking at average hourly earnings and what's happening with labor costs. So that's another big thing. But then also tomorrow, we're going to get an update on the Fed minutes. And so I know investors will be...
possibly learn
what can we potentially see from that, Paul?
I'm just going out to, where is it, Wyoming in August with Michael McKee?
Jackson Hole.
Jackson Hole, yeah. I'm just going to carry his bags, because that's got to be a place where they break news. But there's so much we hear from the Federal Reserve.
Right, especially after those meetings, and then the following week you'll hear from so many of the presidents and the Fed governors, and obviously Powell had his semi-annual testimony recently, made his indications, but still we have that Fed meeting later on this month, and then like you said, we'll have Jackson Hole in August, and then we'll have another Fed meeting in September, so still trying to figure out what exactly does that look like. And even traders right now, they're betting on potential rate cuts in the middle of 2023, so again, driven by those recessionary concerns.
All right, so pro tip when you go to Jackson Hole, do not go up face to face with these buffalo and elk. I mean, I see these videos all the time.
Right.
And then these people get trampled, and they wonder why. I mean, they're wild animals.
I had a source tell me, we were talking about this. I was like, I would kill to go to Jackson Hole. That sounds like so interesting.
Right?
You get to talk to all these people. And they said, he said, why would you want to do that? You would just be in a hot tub with a bunch of Fed officials. And I was like, that's a good point.
That's a good point. All right, Jess, great stuff. Thank you for joining us. Jess Menton, Bloomberg's equities reporter right now. Let's head down to Washington, D.C., 99.1 studio. Nancy Lyons has got the news for us. Nancy, what do you have?
Thanks, Paul. British Prime Minister Boris Yeltsin's cabinet is in flux right now after a variety of scandals. We get the latest from Bloomberg's Roz Matheson in London.
2 very big names in his government are quitting, and that's the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, who was, of course, previously in the Treasury, and now, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. 2 big supporters of Boris Johnson, 2 big members of his cabinet, going within minutes of each other, tweeting that they feel that they've lost confidence in Boris Johnson as a leader.
Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says Johnson has acknowledged in a televised address today that it was a mistake to promote Chris Pincher in February, 2 years after being told of a complaint against the Tory MP. Pincher quit last week after reports alleged that he had groped 2 men. A 21-year-old person of interest in yesterday's Highland Park parade shooting pre-planned his attack for several weeks. That's the word from Lake County Deputy Police Chief Chris Cavelli, who says the suspect, Bobby Cremo, also donned a disguise.
During the attack, Cremo was dressed in women's clothing, and investigators do believe he did this to conceal his facial tattoos and his identity and help him during the escape with the other people who were fleeing the chaos.
Deputy Chief Chris Cavelli says it also appears the gun used in the attack was bought legally. 6 people died, dozens of others were wounded by the shooter who was firing from the top of a downtown building. Vice President Kamala Harris is making a stop in Chicago today. It is unclear whether she will visit Highland Park. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
All right, we've been talking all day about recession, but remember when we talked about global trade and tariffs and all that good stuff? It's kind of back in the news a little bit. I mean, President Biden is talking about rolling back some of the tariffs from the Trump administration. The U.S. is also, I found this story interesting, the U.S. is also asking a big Dutch chip maker to stop selling certain types of machinery to China, which China then uses to make more chips.
Yeah.
And just kind of trying to put the pressure on China here. The U.S. is pushing the Netherlands to ban ASML Holdings from selling to China mainstream technology essential in making a large chunk of the world's chips, expanding its campaign to curb the country's rise. That's according to people familiar with the matter. So even though you're talking about rolling back some tariffs on one hand, on the other hand, the Biden administration's trying to maintain pressure on China as it grows its technology base.
And remember, this has been a part of their strategy on bringing chip making back to American soil. A lot of it comes out of Taiwan at the moment, which once again has geopolitical consequences there. That's interesting about this particular move with ASML is that NVIDIA actually, which is one of the, I should mention, one of the big heavyweights in the S&P 500, not so long ago tried to get access to this kind of technology because it is so unique and because it does kind of serve at this core of semi-equipment making machinery and technology. So what's important here is that there's a lot of people out here for this technology to make that easier. So the United States really getting ahead of it. And Paul, I think it's fascinating that we are still, I want to say, 2, 3, 4 years out from when the trade war really started, and it hasn't really gone away yet.
No, it hasn't. I'm looking here. There's a cool chart in the Bloomberg News story. China has been the biggest buyer of chip-making gear for 2 straight years. Korea's also out there buying Taiwan as well, Japan. But the question is for the U.S., to what extent does the U.S. have the capacity, the willingness to bring some of that production capacity back onshore? That was certainly the talk back in the beginning of the Trump administration. So again, global trade, it's there. Tariffs, it's there. It's not just recession. We'll keep on top of it. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story out of Georgia. According to court filings, Rudy Giuliani, Senator Lindsey Graham, and 5 others have been called to testify before a special grand jury in Atlanta as part of an investigation into attempts by President Trump and his supporters to change the result of the 2020 election. U.S. stocks are trading mixed right now. We have got the S&P lower, the Dow lower. NASDAQ is advancing. The Dow, which had been down at one point as many as 742 points, is now down by 449, a drop right now of 1.5%. S&P down 36, a decline of 1%. NASDAQ up 56, a gain of 0.5%. 10-year yield, 2.79%. Spot gold down 2.3%, 1776 the ounce. But perhaps one of the day's biggest market stories, what's happening with crude oil. West Texas Intermediate plunging 9% now, 98.69. That is a drop of $9.70. We did see WTI briefly trading below $98 a barrel. Treasuries are rallying, stocks are wavering, the prices of commodities are falling as recession fears continue to grip markets, outweighing the optimism over U.S.-China talks aimed at tariff reductions. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We appreciate that. All right, Critty, here is my hot take of the day, and it's a courtesy of our next guest. Stock prices are down, Treasury yields are down, oil prices are down, corporate credit spreads are wider, the dollar exchange rate is higher. This is a recession trade. There's no other way to call it. Neil Dutta, partner and head of economic research, Renaissance Macro Research, joins us on the phone from New York City. And Neil, you put it perfectly. Even somebody like me can kind of put it all together here. Is this something that's been building for a while here? How do you think about recessions and at-risk markets?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing a significant continued repricing in the financial markets, right? I mean, you said it right there. There's no other way of describing what's going on, and I think a lot of this is just a function really of Fed guidance, right? And I think the Fed is getting frankly less data dependent, okay. Right? I mean, in other words, they're hiking aggressively, even when the data, I think, is moved that should be leading them in a direction to not be doing that.
Why do you think they're doing that? Is it just the political fear, the backlash from the markets in terms of being quote unquote behind the curve?
Well, I think that they were so wrong on the transitory inflation view, right? That they almost need to be sure that inflation has turned a corner before they start pivoting off their current policy path. And certainly the Fed's rhetoric has been increasingly hawkish, right? I mean, they're all in on price stability. I think the big story in the last week is just how their assessment of risk management has changed, right? I mean, so in the beginning, it was, they basically have two choices, right? Two doors that they could walk through, both with pretty bad choices. On the one door, behind door number one, is a recession, right? That's a mistake.
Yep.
Behind door number two, let inflation expectations go higher. And faced with those two choices, the Fed's saying that they'll go through door number one, which is the recession. It's like the lesser of two evils from their perspective. And so I think that's what's changed, is that their sort of assessment of risk management. They would much rather have a recession to bring inflation under control than the alternative, which is not doing enough and allowing inflation expectations to keep drifting higher.
Well, inflation expectations keep drifting higher, but I have to ask simply, it kind of sounds like, on the one hand, there's this narrative out there that this is quite literally Chairman Powell's Volcker-esque moment. But then again, we spoke to Anita Markowska of Jefferies, the chief economist there, just a few minutes ago on Bloomberg Television. And she said, well, actually, we don't even need to see that. We might not even be there yet. Can you explain just the wide range here of outcomes that you're seeing?
Well, I mean, as you know, if you put two economists in a room, you're likely to get six opinions. So, I mean, I think that probably goes some way I mean, I think part of this is just what we're seeing, I think, is a flaw in the Fed's sort of expectations management strategy, right? I mean, they kind of, they work through expectations. They try to guide the financial markets. And, the idea, I guess, is to have the meetings essentially be sort of like foregone conclusion by the time they meet, right? I mean, it's already priced in, so we just do whatever the market. But I just think that there are so many moving parts between each meeting. So why would you, play that game? So I just think that, to me, this is supposed to be a data-dependent institution, right? And one of the problems with expectations management is that, you sort of forward guidance, approach that they had been taking is that you kind of lock yourself into a path that becomes difficult to undo. And I think that's happened to some extent, right? I mean, they went 75 in June. They're going to go 75 in July. And what's the off ramp in September? 50 basis points. And remember, I mean, I think this is important for your viewers to understand. The Fed's forecast will likely be revised down in September, both for inflation and for GDP growth. And they're still hiking, relatively aggressively despite that. So if it looks like they're not data dependent, I think that's a big problem for the markets. And that to me is increasingly what looks like is going to happen.
Neil, about 30 seconds here. You mentioned inflation expectations. If you're looking at break-evens here, 5 years, 10 years, even 2-year break-evens, it looks at least chart-wise that they've peaked. Does that mean inflation has peaked?
I mean, I think inflation has peaked. Certainly core inflation has peaked. But I do think that, part of this is just the recession trade, right? I mean, growth expectations are declining. So, of course, inflation expectations will fall. The question is, what does the Fed do about this? Do they take the off-ramp or not? And if they don't, then we can expect these moves to continue.
Oh, boy. All right. Very tough act there for our Federal Reserve. Let's see how it plays out. Neil Dutta, partner and head of economic research, Renaissance Macro Research is the firm, joining us on the phone from New York City. Again, he's calling this, what we're seeing on our screens, the recession trade. You got asset prices declining, you got oil prices declining, the dollar higher. It kind of looks a lot like a recession, and that's what Neil Dutta feels like we're seeing right now. All right, we're going to have more coming up as these markets continue to churn. This is Bloomberg.
broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston, Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco, Bloomberg 960 to the country, Sirius XM Channel 119, and around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
All right, coming up in this half hour, we have to get the latest coming out of London. Some political turmoil there in the highest ranks of government. We'll get the latest there. Plus, we're going to have a really interesting story about the lottery lawyer, how they won the trust of folks who won the big lotto, but then lost their mega millions. Fascinating story in this week's edition of Bloomberg Business Week. But first, let's go to Charlie Pellet for Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you very much. And here's what's going on. Let's talk recovery with what's happening in the markets right now. The S&P is down 19 points. Yes, a drop of 0.5%. But keep in mind, at the worst level of the morning, the S&P have been down 2.2%. NASDAQ now pushing higher, up by 105, higher by 0.9%. The Dow is down 342, a drop there of 1.1%. 10 years up 20-30 seconds, 10-year yield 2.80%. Spot gold down $39, the ounce down 2.2%, 17.66, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 7.9%, trading below $100 a barrel at 99.84 on WTI. Recession fears continue to grip markets, outweighing the optimism over U.S.-China talks aimed at tariff reductions. The odds of a U.S. recession in the next year are now 38%, according to the latest forecast from Bloomberg Economics. So where does that leave the Federal Reserve? Basically between a rock and a hard place, according to Renaissance Capital's Neil Dutta, who was interviewed moments ago right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
You know, they basically have two choices, right? Two doors that they could walk through, both with pretty bad choices. On the one door, behind door number one, is a recession. Behind door number two, let inflation expectations go higher. And faced with those two choices, the Fed's saying that they'll go through door number one, which is the recession. It's like the lesser of two evils from their perspective.
And again, we do have the 10-year now yielding 2.80%. U.S. brokerage firm Cowen up the most in over 2 years after sources told Bloomberg Canadian lender Toronto Dominion Bank is weighing a deal. Shares of Cowen surging now by 28%. Again, recapping, the S&P is down 18, a drop of 0.5%, 10-year yield 2.80%, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 8.1% below $100 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Well, some breaking news coming out of the UK, really just in the last 45 minutes or so. Let's get right to it. We're going to check in with Bloomberg News executive editor for international government, Rosalind Matheson, on these resignations coming out of some key UK cabinet officials. Ros, can you just summarize what's happening in London?
So right as Boris Johnson was speaking this evening, saying he had made a mistake in yet another scandal that's affecting his government, we had news of a double resignation, two very big hitters in his government. The Health Secretary, now former Health Secretary Sajid Javid, who's a former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, of course, and the Chancellor, existing one, Rishi Sunak, both announcing that they were resigning right as he was speaking. Sunak saying, we cannot continue like this, and that he has lost faith in Boris Johnson's leadership. So you've got two of the biggest names in the cabinet stepping down in quick succession, citing his leadership, citing his handling of the economy, amongst multiple other criticisms. The question is, does this set off a domino effect? And now what we're seeing is a bunch of other ministers coming out and saying they intend to stay on and support the Prime Minister. But that's the immediate reaction from them. And what we're likely to see, of course, is now a big cabinet reshuffle. He has to replace those two people. Does that set off further turmoil inside his cabinet? Does that set off further resignation? And certainly the sense that his leadership is really on the line here. Perhaps he's safe tonight, perhaps he's safe for the next couple of weeks, but how much longer is he likely to stay on as Prime Minister? And big question, really, can he stay on to the next election?
Roz, you went exactly where I was going to ask next. In terms of the leadership candidates here who might follow if indeed Boris Johnson is removed from power, he just narrowly avoided a no confidence vote, I want to say a couple of weeks ago. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But What's interesting to me is where some of these leadership candidates stand on the Brexit issue. We know that the UK is being sued by Europe. Can you put us some context in terms of what kind of political future the UK is looking at should Boris Johnson not be in the picture?
The Conservatives have been extremely clear that they're wedded very much to Brexit. That Brexit is not something that would ever be reversed or walked back. In fact, the Labour Party really is saying the same now. In opposition, the feeling is that has moved too far down the line for it ever to be reversed. Of course, some of the antagonism in the process might fade under a new administration. Boris Johnson is threatening to tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol. He's threatening really a trade war, in effect, with Europe about some of the arrangements post-Brexit. So perhaps some of the heat would come out of that in a different administration. But certainly in terms of reversing Brexit entirely, that's not going to happen no matter who would be leading a future government in the UK.
So, Roz, just give us, Americans, a sense of how this plays out. Does Boris Johnson step down under pressure? Is he removed? How does this play out, do you think?
Well, he can't currently be removed because his own lawmakers had a confidence vote against him recently, which he survived. So they can't do that again technically for another year. There is some chatter they might try and change the rules to be able to do that. But the only way is really for the bulk of his government to say we've lost confidence in him, therefore kind of compelling him to step down of his own accord.
And do these two ministers qualify as that type of pressure, or do we need to see more?
We probably do need to see more. The question is, of course, in a messy reshuffle, does some of that accelerate also? You'll see competition, of course, for the position of Chancellor. That's a very senior position in the UK government. And in that process of shuffling the decks, do people get cross or annoyed or frustrated and therefore, again, sort of use that moment to say that they've lost confidence in him? So it's very fraught at the moment. Even if we don't see more resignations this evening, there could be some in the coming days, and certainly through that reshuffle process. So the question is, does it snowball as we go into the latter part of this week?
Ross, 30 seconds here. There is a precedent for this, too. I believe John Arthur's giving me this little factoid. It was the cabinet that forced the issue with Margaret Thatcher back in the day, right?
Well, that's right. And so we've seen this happen before where it's been the very senior members of cabinet saying, that's enough, we've lost confidence in you, to the point where it's really just untenable for a leader to stay on. But of course, Boris Johnson has seen senior departures before. Javid has resigned when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he survived that. So he does have an ability to sort of see his way through crisis after crisis, as we've seen here just in the past couple of years. So it's always difficult to count him out entirely, but certainly it's very difficult to see how you can continue when the bulk of your leadership says that they don't believe in you anymore.
All right, Roz, great stuff. Thank you for jumping on with us at this late hour. For you, breaking news. We appreciate it. Rosalind Matheson, she is the executive editor for international government for Bloomberg News. She is based in London, giving us the latest there. Again, resignations, UK cabinet. Will more happen later this evening or over the next couple of days? We'll keep you on top of that. Right now, let's get the latest on world and national news in Washington, D.C. with Nancy Lyons. Nancy.
Thanks, Paul. Police say the alleged shooter at yesterday's Independence Day parade north of Chicago planned the incident over many weeks. 6 people were killed, dozens of others were wounded when shots were fired from a rooftop. Lake County Deputy Chief Chris Cavelli says the suspect, Bobby Cremo, wore a disguise that helped him leave the parade undetected.
Cremo exited the roof, he dropped his rifle, and he blended in with the crowd, and he escaped.
Deputy Chief Cavelli says Cremo fled to his mother's house, which was near where the shooting took place, and he then borrowed her car. He was eventually pulled over by police and arrested. Still no motive is known. WNBA star Brittany Griner has reached out directly to President Biden with a handwritten note asking him not to forget her while she's being held in Russia. Griner is scheduled to make another court appearance in a Moscow suburb this week, where Russian officials claim she has cannabis oil in her luggage. The U.S. says she's been wrongfully detained. In her letter to the president, Griner said she's scared she might be held there forever. Brittany's wife, Sherelle Griner, spoke with CBS Mornings.
It breaks my heart when I hear her say that, because BG is probably the strongest person that I know, so she doesn't say words like that lightly. that means she truly is terrified that she may never see us again. And, I share those same sentiments.
Again, Sherelle Greiner. She says so far they have not heard anything from President Biden. The Reverend Al Sharpton is also calling on the White House to ease the way for him to make a prayer visit to see Greiner. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, Kriti, did you know that I'm one of the cool kids? I am part of the e-bike wave. I have an e-bicycle.
An e-bicycle?
Yes, so it's like power assisted. You have to pedal, but when you pedal, you can get a little bit of extra boost going uphill. It's not like the delivery people here in New York City that just go flying down the street without pedaling. You actually have to pedal a little bit here. But that got my attention because, this story got my attention because I am an avid e-bike person. They're now thinking about getting these three-wheel delivery vehicles. They're made in Eugene, Oregon by a company named RC Moto. It's called the Deliverator. It's an electric three-wheeler with a reverse tricycle configuration, which means two wheels in the front and one in the back. It makes it look like a giant lobster. Apparently, they want to market these things to all the delivery services, and it's clean, and presumably it's good for the environment, and it's good for this new gig economy that continues to grow.
It also has a top speed of 75 miles per hour, a range of about 100, and costs just $25,000 a year.
Just $25,000. That's a little bit more than an e-bike, but pretty interesting story. But I just think about it here in the city. The delivery people are all over the place now, and they're just flying around the city. And you have to look. I tell people who come to the city, tourists, don't just look where the traffic's coming from. You really have to look for where the guys going the wrong way, because those are guys on those bikes going 40 miles an hour that'll clip you.
Can we talk about the type of cargo they carry? I mean, thinking about these like Amazon warehouse delivery people, they have this entire, I don't want to call them wagons because they're bigger than wagons, but they have all these boxes on them, and they're led by a bike as well, or they're kind of taking them with like carts almost on the sidewalks. It's wild.
It's funny how this is evolving. But again, the electric three-wheelers, they're here to lower your takeout emissions. So if you're worried about, the carbon footprint by, all these deliveries being made to your door, maybe this can be a solution here. So we'll take a look at that. That is on the Bloomberg terminal, kind of an interesting story. People just thinking about going electric in more ways than one in different types of transportation. So if you haven't ridden an e-bike, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun.
I'll just do that.
More coming up. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. The S&P has narrowed its loss now to 13 points, down less than 0.4%. At the worst level of the session, the S&P have been down 83, down 2.2%. The Dow does remain lower by 290, down 0.9%. But at the worst level, the Dow have been down 742, down 2.4%. We are seeing stocks recover. The prices of commodities are falling as recession fears continue to grip markets, outweighing the optimism over U.S.-China talks aimed at tariff reductions. 10-year yield right now, 2.81%. We've got spot gold down $40 the ounce to $17.67, a drop there of 2.2%. The big commodity story of the day is crude oil. West Texas Intermediate is plunging 8.5% right now, below $100 a barrel. WTI at $99.29, down right now by just about $9.19 a barrel. Again, recapping, we've got stocks trading mixed. The S&P down 15 now, drop there of 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. We highlighted last week, the current edition of Bloomberg Business Week is their heist edition, where it's all kinds of stories of skullduggery and thievery, and we've got a good one today from that edition. Simon Van Zylen-Wood, freelance reporter for Bloomberg Business Week, joins us on the phone from New York City. Simon, talk to us about this lawyer guy, the lottery lawyer. What's his scam?
Okay, so first of all, glad to be here. Well, let's soften it before we get into calling it a scam, because he is going on trial in about 2 weeks, so we have to say alleged with him, although he has some co-conspirators who I'll get into who have all pled guilty, and so scammy indeed this looks. Essentially, the lottery lawyer is a guy named Jason Kurland, and he cornered a niche market of the legal world by representing newly minted Powerball and Mega Millions winners. And so he'd show up on the Today Show or all over the internet, basically saying, if you've won money and you're bewildered and you have no idea what to do with it, call me, I'm your guy. And, you know, as some of your listeners may know, a lot of lottery winners are not financially sophisticated. They end up blowing it all. They feel like they've got to give it to friends or family or whatever. And so this guy takes advantage of this opening. He is alleged to basically have squandered over $100 million from some of the bigger lottery winners in recent history on a variety of colorful schemes. And that's sort of the top line of it.
So how did he get caught here?
So that's a great question, because there's these overlapping criminal schemes that are at play here. So there was there was a Ponzi scheme involved, and so we don't really need to explain why the Ponzi scheme's involved. But basically, a guy purporting to be a jeweler in Long Island was saying he could get massive returns on jewelry. Think like the Uncut Gems Adam Sandler movie, but like in Long Island. He ends up getting pinched with the Ponzi scheme, and that Ponzi scheme overlaps with the lottery lawyer. That guy, the Ponzi scheme jeweler guy, ends up becoming a confidential informant and starts wiretapping calls involved with the lottery lawyer. And that, I think, ends up toppling some dominoes. Other people start flipping. There's wiretaps up the wazoo in this case, and eventually they whittle it down, and they figure out that the lottery lawyer has been losing money on behalf of the people that he's supposed to be managing, their money and growing it, not, throwing it down the toilet.
What are some of the quote-unquote investments that these folks made on behalf of their clients? Because it seems to me, I always say to myself, when I see somebody on the TV screen holding up that big check for $1 bajillion, I would just buy treasuries, 30-year treasuries and go to sleep.
They do. So this is the irony. So these guys, they varying levels of financial sophistication. But so one of his big winners in 2018, the biggest single lottery winner of all time, meaning she was a South Carolina woman who kept her identity private, $1.5 billion jackpot and before tax. And she said to him, please invest conservatively. And he was like, sure. Turns out that one of the bigger investment schemes was something called the merchant cash advance business. He and some buddies in Long Island got into MCAs. And what that is, it's almost like kind of gray area legal loan sharking, highly extractive loans incredibly high interest rates, up to 400%. It's for people with bad credit, desperate for cash. Maybe they have criminal history. Who knows? Very popular kind of gray area industry here in New York State. He decides this would be a great investment scheme. The guys he ends up partnering with are total crooks. One of whose grandfather was the head boss of the Colombo crime family.
Oh, now we're talking.
Yeah, and so that's maybe not the guy. I don't know if you Googled him or not, but like that might not be the guy you want to get in business. Now he says, I've got something called PPE, and I'm going to make a ton of money on it. And then that's the final way they keep losing money.
There's a lot of layers to this story. Clearly, let's add one more. Talk to us about Cheddar Capital.
Yeah, so Cheddar Capital, ridiculous name. And if you Google it, like this is the name of a business. You can't even find it. It's like there's that Vanity Fair website called Cheddar, and then there's the cheese, and it's like, is this even a real thing? Cheddar was one of the merchant cash advance businesses that he was putting a lot of the lottery winners' money in. And I think at the beginning, it's possible that this was such an extractive and lucrative industry, actually, that they were making a fair amount of money on it. It's just that it seemed to have been terribly mismanaged. So Cheddar, once the Cheddar money started allegedly disappearing, that toppled a bunch of other dominoes, which led us down the road I was just telling you about.
So, Simon, there are four kind of main characters in your story here, but the lottery lawyer himself, and three of them have already pled guilty and they're waiting sentencing, but the lottery lawyer himself, he's going to trial, right? Give us a sense of the timing. When's that going to occur? What's the expectation about how that might play out?
Yeah, so the trial is in New York Southern District in about a week. I think jury selection is like in a week. Looks like at least a couple of co-conspirators will testify against him. His own brother-in-law, who's a very colorful character, he's a cosmetic surgeon in Long Island, called Scott Blyer, whose handle on Instagram is Dr. B. Fixin, and definitely worth a look if you're on Instagram. He will be testifying apparently against his own brother-in-law and a whole separate aspect of this. I would say this, between all the lawyers I talked to and people involved in the case, everyone is shocked that this guy, the lottery lawyer, was even going to trial. He was fired from his law firm, Rivkin Radler, which is based in Long Island, as soon as the allegations hit. The wiretaps are incriminating. There's three other guys who pled guilty. But his lawyer, I think my guess is he's trying to clear his name, because even if he takes a plea, I think he's worried he's never going to work again. And his whole reputation was based on integrity, right? I'm going to help you manage your money. I'm the good guy. And his record was spotless until then. He seemed like a family guy. He just seemed pretty milquetoast. I think he's throwing a Hail Mary to try to clear his name. And the lawyers basically, I think, are going to argue that he himself was scammed by his co-conspirators, that he invested money in a bunch of bad schemes, and it wasn't his fault. The problem is that he, allegedly unbeknownst to the winners, was taking a cut of the investment in terms of in like these things like Cheddar Capital, these businesses, and was allegedly spending it on, classic cliches like Saks Fifth Avenue, an SUV, like you name it, that kind of stuff. And so might be a tall hurdle for them to get an acquittal.
All right. Are you going to follow the trial?
I have to. I'm pot committed. I'm obsessed with this story.
All right, we'll have you back when we get some kind of resolution there to the trial. Simon Van Zylenwood, freelance reporter for Bloomberg Business Week, joining us on the phone from New York City. Simon's story, is featured in the Heist issue of Business Week magazine. That's available on newsstands, on the Bloomberg, and at Bloomberg.com/businessweek. Apparently the Heist issue is an annual issue for Business Week, widely anticipated for all the crazy stories that our reporters dig up, dealing mostly with financial chicanery. So good stuff there. This is Bloomberg.
close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is Countdown to the Close, just 60 minutes left in your trading session. Caroline Hyde, Taylor Riggs, Katie Greifeld in the house, joined now by Kriti Gupta and Paul Sweeney. We together welcome across our audiences, TV, radio and YouTube. A day where the markets are trying to find some sort of bottom. We're actually off just 0.3% in the S&P now, Kriti. Oh, Paul.
Here that you are starting to see a rebound. I mean, if you had asked me what the market story was just a couple of hours ago even, I would have said, well, it's going down, down, down. To see this reversal, it makes me question how much of the trade is actually fundamental in nature, Paul.
Yeah, and I'm really looking at commodities here, particularly crude oil. It's just been weak all day. WTI crude oil off 8.5%. We're now below that $100 per barrel level, and that gets people's attention as they're paying, north of $5 a gallon at the pump.
There certainly are. Oil, a key recession indicator, potentially. We're going to go into them any moment now, but I'm looking at the market, trying to shake off some of those recession concerns. Remember, earlier in the trade, we'd all been optimistic about perhaps tariffs being rolled back on Chinese imports in particular, what that means for inflation pressures. The S&P, though, sunk to as low as more than a percentage point off as we worried more about those recession risks, now only off by 1/3%. We're down 14 points. The Dow, laggard a choice, off by more than a percentage point, almost a percentage point right now, 300 points to the down. We're seeing the Russell 2000 also off by 0.2%. But go figure, the NASDAQ currently up 130 points, 1.12% higher, Katie.
And let's take a look at the sectors and see what's driving that rebound. Caroline, like you said, tech seeing a bid today, that sector up about 0.9%. Communication services, consumer discretionary, also seeing a big bid today. But still, you have 8 of 11 sectors in the red still. We'll see how this changes in about an hour. If you look at the bottom of the pack, it's energy. That sector down over 5% still as we talk about this amazing move that we're seeing in crude.
I tried to keep it positive here. So we take a look at some of the big movers. Of course, in the red is TD Bank on the news of maybe looking at acquiring Cowen, the U.S. brokerage here, and sort of analysts coming out. And I think it was interesting, a survey of some of the biggest analysts who cover the stock, saying that it is reasonable at a reasonable price. And so maybe looking at this deal on reports of that. We take a look at some of the other big movers here. Riot Blockchain is one that I'm looking at. As you're taking a look at Bitcoin, that's actually higher on the day, trying to hold on to that key $20,000 level. And then Netflix is also interesting. There was a report from Piper Sandler that if they add ads to this tier, that it could add an additional about $1.4 billion in additional revenue. So Caroline, that certainly has that stock higher, just about 2% or so.
Meanwhile, tell you who's having a day. Boris Johnson. Having a day. We're currently, though, not seeing the ramifications really on British assets right now. I show for our radio audience the British pound off by 1.4%. It had been down throughout the day because really this is a story of dollar strength amid the recession fears. But I just want to keep our viewers up to date that we have had several more resignations coming from private secretaries to, of course, the Prime Minister Jonathan Gullis has been resigning, Sakib Bhatti as well as the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party too. So following hot on the heels of the Health Secretary and indeed the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, who announced resignation but a few hours ago.
Yeah, Caroline, I think it's interesting when we're talking about the context of those kind of decisions, because remember, the UK is still dealing with a massive cost of living crisis. Inflation still the name of the game there. And really, as they're staring down the barrel of a potential recession, that R word, which was driving the markets and has been driving the markets, I want to say not just today, but for the last 6 months or so. We caught up with Sarah House, the senior economist at Wells Fargo. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Overall, we're looking at an economy losing momentum faster than what we anticipated. So right now we have a recession call for beginning the first half of next year. But I think if anything, the data shows that timing looks like it could be even sooner.
And, I think it's so interesting what Sarah House is saying there, because the timing is so crucial. She's talking about perhaps at the end of 2023, when you have some of these recession calls from we're in it right here, right now, Paul, to as late as the end of 2024. That range is really baffling to me.
It really is. And, we take a look at the volatility index because the market's discounting recession and inflation. What are the big issues? I'm looking at the VIX here, 27.57. We were pushing up north close to 30 earlier in the session here, but this rebound in the market here in the last couple hours has pulled that back a little bit.
And Katie, that's what's interesting, because we've had you on this program a few times, and we've consistently talked about the lack of the big move higher in VIX, the lack of the sort of big 40 level that we saw, the big washout level, though we increasingly hear calls that it could go down in S&P to 35, 3,100, 3,000, I think was Morgan Stanley's Mike Wilson in sort of some scenarios. So you do wonder if we haven't quite reached sort of those big washout levels yet.
And you have to wonder, at what point will the VIX start to move? Is it really stuck below 30 for the rest of our natural lives? I don't know. It's starting to feel that way, though, if you look at the disconnect between markets and the VIX. I don't know, if you look across the calendar of what's to come this week, it's already been a pretty busy day. We do have some key data releases. Maybe that'll ignite some excitement, at least when it comes to volatility.
And Fed minutes as well. Really, it's backward looking, we understand that, but really trying to get to grips with whether the Federal Reserve is going to be reacting. What is their reaction function to some of this slower data? Because, boy, over in Europe, we're already factoring in a recession. No wonder the euro is so low against the dollar at the moment, Paul, because we're worried about some of that economic data coming in, showing how much, at the moment, the slowdown is upon us.
Absolutely right, and not the way. We get about a week till we get earnings coming out. We get the earnings season kicking in, the big banks, and we'll get a sense of really what corporations are seeing in their businesses today, plus more importantly, the forecast going forward. It's going to be very interesting earnings season coming up.
And as we talk about the earnings season, let's just bring it full circle to where we started at 9:30 a.m. this morning, the FX story. How much of the pain is going to start showing up in those earnings, in the face, by the way, of a much, much stronger dollar. At least that seems to be the trade that's not only weighing on commodities today, but was weighing on the S&P 500, Katie, earlier in the session.
Earnings season never ends. That's my hot take. But before we get there to maybe the next round, we do have jobs on Friday. So excited for that. The expectation is to hold steady the unemployment rate at 3.6%. Have to wonder how long that can last.
Notable as well. It feels in the tech sector already that the unemployment rate has been ticking up a little bit. But it's notable, really, that technology is perhaps your haven of choice today. The fact that we do see the bid into Google and PayPal and some of the tech names amid what is meant to be sort of a risk-off kind of a day.
Which is so crazy when you think we're going back to 2020, Paul, and sort of the way that we're viewing tech as a safe haven. We mentioned tech. I want to pull out this note from Lightshed Management that just came out about their quarterly earnings scorecard. They're looking at the word inflation in the last quarter. The words mentioned on those earnings calls increased 158 times on 58% of the calls. Most notably, Amazon accounted for 20 of those mentions last quarter. So you are starting to hear it enter the vocabulary of some of these CEOs.
I think it'd be interesting to see recession, the R word. I think that'll be the word of the quarter coming up here as corporations try to sense the impact on their top lines and on their margins as well.
Well, lots to digest there. That does it for now for the Bloomberg TV and radio simulcast. We'll be back in about an hour at 4 p.m. for our Beyond the Bell coverage when we take you to today's market close.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
There you are, listening to Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio. Carol Masser, Tim Stenovic, they are off today. Kriti Gupta and I are with you. And looking at these markets here, again, a big sell-off off the S&P, off about 2% at the low this morning, but it's been trading back. We're almost back to even on the S&P. The Nasdaq's actually showing a lift here. So it's just a crazy volatility day in the equity markets.
You know, I think it's interesting here about what's actually on the inside driving the market, because if you had looked, Paul, we were together actually.
Yes,
9
we were.
in the movers. It's been a day, folks. Paul and I are on this journey together. At 9 a.m., we were talking about movers, and the downside movers here were the big tech names, and the upside movers were the commodity names. If you look at what the market is doing right now, it is the polar opposite.
Exactly right.
It's your big tech names that are outperforming. It's your commodity names, your oil, your Freeport-McMoRan for copper, that are tanking. And really, to me, Paul, this is a macro issue. It's all coming down to what the dollar's doing.
Yeah, it's a macro issue, and the question is, how will the corporations, the companies, when they start reporting earnings next week, how are they going to frame this? Because, boy, you don't know where inflation is going. You don't know where this economy is going. Is it a recession? If so, how deep? So it's going to make talking about your business and, more importantly, forecasting your business for some of the analysts, investors out there. So it'll be really interesting to once again pay attention to what these corporations say about their businesses, because we know the macro data that we get, including the jobs report coming on Friday are painting kind of a mixed picture at best. So again, earnings starting next week with the big banks. That'll be the focus. Right now, the focus is Nancy Lyons down in Washington, D.C., World and National News. Nancy.
Thanks, Paul. President Biden's special envoy to Iran is blasting that country following the collapse of the latest talks over its tattered nuclear deal. Bloomberg's Nathan Hager has more from Washington.
More than a little bit of a wasted occasion is how Special Envoy Robert Malley is describing the recent indirect negotiations in Doha. Speaking with National Public Radio, Malley says Iran rejected, quote, very detailed outlines of an arrangement the U.S. was willing to accept to revive the 2015 accord. President Biden's been trying for more than a year to restore the Iran nuclear deal. Since then, President Trump pulled the U.S. out in 2018. Biden has maintained sanctions since then, while Iran has ramped up nuclear activity. Now, Special Envoy Malley says the party that hasn't said yes to a deal is Iran. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
While there may be no deal with Iran, there was some progress today on expanding NATO to include Finland and Sweden. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says he's thankful NATO members are allowing the accession process to start.
I commend all allies for moving so quickly in accepting Finland and Sweden's applications for membership. And I want to thank Turkey, Finland and Sweden for their constructive approach.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg believes it'll take months, not the usual year or more, for Finland and Sweden to become full-fledged members. But Turkey today is renewing its threat to keep them out of NATO if they do not fulfill their promises to extradite terror suspects. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, I am not in the Tesla market, but Tesla investors have a lot to parse after the July 4th holiday. A disappointing quarter of deliveries, a record month of production, and now several weeks of downtime at multiple plants. So I think this Model Y, they make it in Shanghai. That's going to be down for first 2 weeks of July. And then the Model 3 line for 20-day stretch beginning July 18th. I mean, auto manufacturers often shut down their lines in the summertime to retool and everything. But I guess if you're a company, you're a stock that's really tied towards production numbers, that's a big thing.
That is a big thing. Can we just talk for a moment about these factories in particular? I'm going to share a little fun fact that Ed Ludlow once told me.
Okay.
He said that the Shanghai factory not only is the most productive factory for Tesla around the world. Remember, they have factories in Berlin and Austin and California, et cetera. But it's their most productive factory. And one of the reasons for that is its location is right near where all the raw materials for cars come from. So it's a very easy, in terms of supply chains, it's a very easy process for that particular factory to get their raw materials, to get the commodities, to get the chips that take that are needed in an EV, and all brought together in the Shanghai factory, as opposed to getting those raw materials, sticking them on a ship, flying them across to California or Austin or wherever. And that's why that factory is so productive.
Efficient. Okay, good to know. Good to know. Yeah. Well, the good news, I guess, for Tesla, I'm just looking through this Bloomberg article. It made more vehicles in June than any month in its history. So they're cranking through June. Scheduled shutdowns in July, and they're still talking big production for the year. But it's interesting, for the other OEMs, it's not so much about production; it's about profit per unit. Here for Tesla, the production numbers are actually, and hitting those production numbers are key for the company and for the stock.
Yeah, and I have to say, I feel like for Tesla, they've started to get to a profitability story. They've started to get to an affordability story, but brand value to people whose grandparents bought Ford, GM, will Tesla still hold that value? We're going to discuss all of it. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. What a recovery on Wall Street. At one point, the S&P 500 index was down 2.2%. It has now narrowed that loss to 0.3%, down by 10 points. Fast-moving markets. Let's head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. That's right. U.S. stocks trading mixed right now, but well off their session lows. Dow's down 246 points, was down 742. S&P's pares losses to 9, while the NASDAQ is higher by 136. The U.S. 10-year yield at 2.81%. Gold and oil are both under pressure today. WTI crude futures are down 8%, and Bitcoin is trading higher by 1.2%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, only tech, telecom, and consumer discretionary were in the green. Leaders to the upside in the Dow, Salesforce, Nike, and Apple, while IBM and Chevron led to the downside. In deal news, Cowen jumped 27% after Toronto Dominion is said to weigh a deal. In other news, Roblox jumped 12%. And wrapping things up, energy names stayed under pressure with Halliburton, Hess, and Southwestern, each falling 9%. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill, and to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg type Squawk SQQAWK on your terminal. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate that. All right, Critty, remember this Archegos management story from a few months back? Bill Huang and those guys.
Rings a bell, Viacom, et cetera.
Yes, lost gajillions of dollars, $20 billion in a matter of days. It seems like $20 billion. Well, he's got a lot of legal problems. He's got criminal issues. Now he's got former employees suing him, saying, "What about my bonus? I didn't steal any money." Greg Farrell, investigative reporter for the legal enforcement team from Bloomberg News, joins us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Greg, this guy's got a lot of legal issues that just seem to be mounting up. Now he's got employees coming back and saying, "You got to pay me my bonus." Is that a thing?
Yes. So today's lawsuit is from one former employee, but I would guess he represents a number of others, or others will join him because the same thing happened to him, to them, that they were guaranteed that any money they put into their deferred comp program over a period of several years would never go below par.
Okay.
It would be backstopped, et cetera, and only to have it blow up in March of last year.
I have to ask, though, let's start with Paul here, actually, because I have to ask about the bonus dynamic.
I want my bonus, and I want it all, and I want it in cash.
Same, but
yes.
But you've worked on Wall Street for ages, and I have to ask about how this perhaps bonus structure is different from some of the banks.
Yeah, it goes one of two ways. One is you're just on a completely discretionary bonus, and it could be zero or any number above that. It's not a negative number, which is another whole issue. Or you're under a contract, and you owe me a $5 million guaranteed bonus, maybe even plus X% of the fees I bring in, something structured like that. But when there's a case of fraud, as potentially in this case, what's the play? Is my call, if I'm the employee, I just say, "Hey, I didn't do anything wrong. Why can't I get my money back?"
That's one element of it. Another element is that this is a good time for former employees to go after him because Bill Huang's been charged criminally.
Yep.
So that bolsters the case, is that the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan's already accused Bill Huang and another top executive of criminal behavior. This will support in a civil suit like this. But then you get to the question of, let's say he wins. Where's the money? Is there money? And also the value, the purported value of the deferred comp program was like $500 million as of end of 2020, early 2021. Was that a real number, or was that the result of a lot of the same gamesmanship that Huang was accused of pulling off in the 2 years that led to the implosion?
So, Greg, what does he have to do to get rid of these charges? Is it just a matter of paying them their bonuses?
Right now, this is not a priority. Criminal charges are always a priority because he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Legal hassles and, chase the money, whether or not I'll pay you, that's completely secondary. So this is not good news for Bill Huang, but the important thing, the thing that really threatens him and his CFO were the criminal charges of a few months ago. There is a concern, or I don't know this, but it's possible that prosecutors don't always prosecute everything that someone allegedly did wrong, only the things they can identify. If this gets the attention of criminal prosecutors and leads to an expansion of the case, that would be trouble. But at least as of now, this is definitely a secondary matter in terms of Bill Wang. Civil is just not this. It's not as serious as criminal.
What's the status of his criminal situation with the government? Is there an expectation for a timeline, a plea deal, or a timeline to actually going to trial?
Yes.
What's the
feeling?
So
there's already been at least one hearing on this, and there's going to be another hearing in August. I think it's expected that, I don't think there'll be a plea deal. They both, he and the CFO, Patrick Halligan, through their lawyers, plan to fight this. Secondly, I think given the complexity of this and the fact that we're now in the summer and nothing's really going to happen until September, suggests that in a complicated like this, if there's a trial, it will be next year. That's not a guarantee, but ballpark figure, it'll probably be next year.
And is his defense, I didn't do it?
No, there's two defenses. So good question. The main charges against Bill Wang and Pat Halligan from 2 months ago were, one, market manipulation, and two, lying to the banks. In terms of the defense of market manipulation, there's a lot of gray area there because, yes, he didn't let each bank, each counterparty know what he was planning to do, but he was trading openly. He was trading in stocks he liked, trying to get their value up, as any investor does. So I think there's going to be a robust argument as to whether or not market manipulation, can be proved. However, it's a federal law to lie to banks, and that's going to be much more, I wouldn't say slam dunk, but a much easier case for federal prosecutors to make is that you can't lie to banks. Even if you didn't cheat them and they didn't lose money, you cannot make a false representation to them. And that's going to be a much more difficult challenge for both those guys to defend against.
Fascinating stuff. 30 seconds. Has someone else gone through these kind of proceedings before? Any kind of precedent here?
No, I think the Bill Wang, the criminal case, is highly unusual. The market manipulation theory, that's why I think this could get interesting in court, and that he might be able to mount, he's got a very good lawyer, a legitimate defense. So, it really is, Wang is sort of a one-off.
Right. All right, good stuff. Greg Farrell, thank you so much for joining us. Greg Farrell, investigative reporter for the legal enforcement team from Bloomberg News, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Red headline just going across the tape here. Johnson said to plan to stay on and appoint new cabinet ministers. So that is some breaking news on what's going on over in London with Boris Johnson. We will certainly have more reporting on that as it unfolds. But again, ministers resigning, Johnson saying he's going to stay on. We'll have more. This is Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston. Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco. Bloomberg 960 to the country. Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
All right, coming up in this half hour, we're going to have Kriti Gupta's chart of the day. Can't wait to see that. Plus, we're going to have the drive to close today with Sylvia Jablonski, Chief Investment Officer at Defiance ETFs. What does she make of days like today, the volatility? Are these some of the days that might be suggesting a bottom, or do we have more to go? We'll check in with her. But first, let's go to Charlie Pellet for Bloomberg Business Flash.
S&P, NASDAQ, right now they are trading mixed. We have got the S&P down 4 points, a drop there of 0.1%. What a recovery for the S&P. Have been down as many as 83 points, down 2.2%, but right now the S&P is down by less than 0.1%. NASDAQ best level of the day, or close to it, up 168, up 1.5%, and the Dow is down 183, a drop there of 0.6%. 10 years up 17.30 seconds, 10-year yield 2.81%. Spot gold down $41 the ounce to $17.67, a drop there of 2.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 7.9%, $99.83 for a barrel of WTI. Investors continue to fret over a potential U.S. recession, stubborn inflation, and the outlook for a Federal Reserve rate hike. Sam Stovall is Chief Investment Strategist at CFRA, and he was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
I guess the rule of Wall Street is you don't fight the Fed, and I think that the Fed does have to remain aggressive because this is now the sixth time since World War II that we have had the year-on-year change in CPI above 6.5%, and every prior time we slipped into both a bear market and a recession. So I think there are still concerns ahead.
The odds of a U.S. recession in the next year are now 38%, according to the latest forecast from Bloomberg Economics. Ford sales jumped 31.5% in June, thanks to bid gains from its top-selling pickup truck line, including the electric F-150 Lightning. Ford shares, they're down today by 1.6%. General Motors shares are up by 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude, again, down 8% right now, $99.80 a barrel on WTI. Gold down 2.3%, 10-year yield 2.82%, S&P 500 index down 0.5 point. What a recovery there. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, good stuff right there. We appreciate it. All right, it is that time of day. Let's get the chart of the day. Kriti Gupta, Bloomberg Markets correspondent. There's a million ways you could go on this, I'm guessing. What do you have for us, Kriti?
There are a million ways. I mean, man, I should have done a euro-dollar chart today, and I just didn't because I wanted to shake things up for Tom Keene, our very own one and only. And so I just decided to go a different route and look at a different part of the world, and that, of course, is China. So my chart of the day shows tariffs on the United States and China, specifically U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. We're looking at about 19.3% of tariffs. China has about 20.7%. This is significant because this comes as we talk about the Biden administration perhaps trying to ease some of those tariffs on China in a way to deal with inflation. When you are buying something from China, it comes to, say, the port of LA or Long Beach or wherever, and those extra tariffs are basically passed on to the importers right at the coast, then passed on into the costs of transport, passed on to the consumer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It is a tax on the consumer, as a politician might say.
As a politician might say, indeed. What's interesting, though, is that this is something that the Biden administration hasn't been extremely vocal about. It's kind of a no-brainer here, given that these were Trump-era tariffs, and the idea being that, if President Trump put them on, then President Biden was also, when he was elected, at least seen as perhaps better for those geopolitical tensions. That hasn't really been the case, and that those tariffs have remained on. In fact, I would argue that geopolitical tensions is even heightened with the war in Ukraine in the background. So the question for a lot of people right now is, do those tariffs get removed? Do you keep up those geopolitical tensions at the expense of inflation? Or vice versa? And remember, we talked earlier in the show about the United States actively telling ASML, the Dutch semi equipment maker, don't sell your technology to China. Right. So we know this is something that's brewing in the background anyway. So my chart of the day just shows you that that is still a dynamic that's very much in play. Janet Yellen had a conversation with the Vice Premier of China saying, potentially talking about their concerns and how they could work together. The question of tariffs did not necessarily come up, but of course that speculation doesn't go away.
I've seen a lot of people call into question the validity or the effect of tariffs. Mm-hmm. Did they in fact impact negatively China? Yeah. And also, did they negatively impact the U.S. consumers with higher prices such that we would benefit now if those were rolled back? It's less than clear to me that all of those things are, actually happened as they were intended.
Yeah, and I would argue that a lot of that, the effects you're not going to find out immediately anyway. It's still fairly new. And I think in addition to, yes, we did see higher costs passed on. The economists, I think the consensus here is that there were higher costs passed on to the consumer. But you also saw this kind of motivation for a lot of multinational companies that are based in the United States to come and say, well, we're going to move our supply chain back to the States. Right. One, because there's federal incentives to do that. And two, you'd get removal of those tariffs, And if you're not bringing them into the United States, maybe nearshore them, as that's a little buzzword there, to Mexico, for example. Hasbro was very vocal about this. They said, okay, well, we're not going to import toys from China anymore. We'll just build them right here in Mexico. We know car makers have the same dynamic.
Right. Well, speaking of cars, Matt's car is stuck in Mexico because they don't have enough chips. Actually, his truck, I should rename it. His truck is stuck in. Yes, I know. So he cannot get his Chevy Silverado with some kind of displacement, some silliness there. I don't know.
And this follows his giant carton of furniture from Berlin that's still stuck in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere.
Yeah, so you talk about the supply chain issues definitely impacting him. But it's interesting. I'm just not sure. It'll be interesting to see kind of the rhetoric that this administration can continue to have, the discussions they can have with China, if it's even possible. I just don't know what is really possible with China, but it seems to be a tech Cold War, if you will, kind of brewing there. And that kind of makes sense because you just don't know what China's ambitions are.
Yeah, and I think this is also where, let's bring it full circle. The currency picture comes back in handy because we talk about dollar-yen weakness so much, but let's also look at the weakness that you're seeing in the Chinese renminbi or the yuan, if you prefer to call it that, or if you're looking at the Korean won, by the way. These are all export economies. If you see the Japanese yen get weaker and weaker and weaker, that means their exports are more and more attractive, especially in the face of a stronger dollar. Now you have China competing, you have the Korean won or Koreans competing as well. How much of currency depreciation or manipulation do you start to see in the wake of all these FX moves?
All right, good stuff as always, Kriti. You can get Kriti's chart of the day at kgupta129 at bloomberg.net. And also check out her social game. It is quite strong, so I am told. Twitter, Instagram, all that kind of good stuff at Kriti Gupta News. That's called branding right there. Kriti Gupta News. I like that. They tell us to do that. I don't think I've gotten around to doing that, but Kriti's got some strong social game there. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news. Nancy Lyons. Nancy, what do you have?
Thanks, Paul. The suspected July 4th parade shooter in Illinois apparently used a legally purchased rifle and dressed as a woman to escape police. Today, investigators offered those new details about the incident that has now claimed 7 lives, with officials saying yet another victim has died from their injuries. Lake County Deputy Chief Chris Covelli.
He brought a high-powered rifle to this parade. He accessed the roof of a business via a fire escape ladder and began opening fire.
Deputy Chief Covelli says the suspect was eventually apprehended in his mother's car. A Georgia grand jury is subpoenaing Rudy Giuliani to investigate potential criminal interference in the 2020 election. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reports Fulton County is also summoning other members of former President Trump's legal team, along with South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham. 2 of the most senior members of Boris Johnson's cabinet have quit in quick succession, a dramatic move that puts the UK Prime Minister in deep peril after a series of scandals. Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Health Secretary have both left.
You've got 2 of the biggest names in the cabinet stepping down in quick succession, citing his leadership, citing his handling of the economy, amongst multiple other criticisms. The question is, does this set off a domino effect? And now what we're seeing is a bunch of other ministers coming out and saying they intend to stay on and support the Prime Minister.
Bloomberg's Roz Matheson in London. Johnson survived a confidence vote last month, and that's left him safe from a leadership challenge for another 12 months. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
All right, this is a good story on the Bloomberg Terminal. We talk a lot about the 60-40 portfolio. It's a classic 60-40 portfolio where investments are split 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds. That's taken a beating this year as both asset classes have plunged. And there's a great chart in this Bloomberg article, and it's down, and it's not good. The 60-40 portfolio had its worst start to the year since 1988. Basically, pretty, just year to date, there's been nowhere to hide, really. When you think about stocks down 20% plus on the S&P, when you think about corporate bonds, even treasuries down double digit. I mean, unless you had a barrel of oil in your apartment like Lisa Abramowitz, it was a tough year to make money.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point about how you actually invest in the back half of the year, because that commodities hedge that everyone is saying, get into oil, get into natural gas, that is the trade that is winning. Yes, the trade that's winning, but isn't there a saying on Wall Street, correct me if I'm wrong, that past performance is no indication of future success or something like that? This is so true, because a lot of these people who are hopping into the commodities trade right now, forgive me for my rant here, Paul, who are hopping into the commodity trade right now, there's an argument to be made that if you were staring at a recession could come at any point, we may even be in it, isn't that the very first trade that collapses?
Yes.
And this is a trade that everyone is saying is going to be the hedge of the year again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about, every year we get all the reports from the university endowments and how they just had monster years over the past couple of years. And a lot of that was due towards, kind of a 60-40, but then they really, I think, try to enhance it with a lot of alternative investments, private equity, venture capital. Yeah. There's no place for those types of investors to hide this year. So it'll be interesting to see what the endowments report this year. I mean, we had 50% increases. Duke was up 52% last year, leading the way, and it's just be interesting to see. They took that risk on the way up. Let's see how that risk works on the way down. Right now, we have markets kind of mixed at the moment.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. What a recovery for the U.S. stock market. We've got the S&P, yes, on the minus side, but minutes ago, it did tick higher, barely. Right now, we have got the S&P down 1 point, drop there of less than 0.1%, flat on the day, but at the worst level of the session, the S&P have been down 83 points, down 2.2%. Dow Industrials remain lower by 171, drop there of 0.5%. NASDAQ close to session highs, up 172, a gain there of 1.5%. 10-year yield, 2.81%. Spot gold down $41 the ounce to $17.67, lower now by 2.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 8%, down $8.66 for a barrel of WTI at $99.77 right now on West Texas Intermediate crude. Sources tell Bloomberg Broadcom's $61 billion deal for VMware will move forward after a rival bidder failed to emerge to break up the deal for the cloud computing company during its so-called go shop period. Broadcom shares, they're down 0.5%. VMware lower now by 0.1%. Recapping, S&P just turning positive again, up now by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. It is 3:48 on Wall Street.
The following is an editorial from Bloomberg Opinion.
Later in July, the U.S. public health emergency that's been in place since early 2020 is scheduled to end. One unanticipated consequence, millions of Americans could lose their health insurance. Here's why. In the early days of COVID-19, the government offered states extra Medicaid funding so long as they didn't boot anyone off the program during the public health emergency. Whenever the emergency ends, and it could be extended further, states will need to restart eligibility assessments for more than 80 million Medicaid beneficiaries. Millions could lose their coverage in the process. Federal and state officials will need to work closely to prevent this from happening. For example, the federal government could phase down its extra Medicaid payments slowly, encouraging states to reassess their rosters more methodically and reducing the risk of administrative errors. Pandemic-era spending won't last forever, but lawmakers can smooth the transition to avoid a crisis. This editorial was written by the Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board. I'm David Shipley. For more Bloomberg Opinion, please go to Bloomberg.com/opinion or OPN Go on the Bloomberg terminal.
This has been Bloomberg Opinion.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Crazy intraday of trading is how I'll put it. I started the day here with Greedy, and the markets were looking down a couple of percent. And here we have the S&P flat. We even got a 1.5% increase on NASDAQ. That is what I call intraday volatility. How does the professionals, how do they view this type of volatility? Sylvia Jablonski, Chief Investment Officer of Defiance ETFs, joins us on the phone from New York City. So Sylvia, when you see price action like today, again, down big, now trying to claw our way back to positive territory, what do you take away from that type of price movement?
Hi, good afternoon. Great to be here today. Look, I think intraday volatility, intraday chaos is another good way of putting it. I think that, what we're seeing now is just sort of everything coming to a T here, right? We've had these headwinds that are, feeling sort of obvious to us. We've been worried about inflation, being worse than we expected. Turns out it wasn't transient. It hasn't come down as quickly as we thought it would. There were supply chain issues which haven't fully resolved, geopolitics, aggressive Fed. All of these things have been things that we were talking about, and lo and behold, that they have now hit the market, and we have all three major indices in bear market correction territory. So what I think is happening now, though, is that you're starting to get a rethink amongst investors, because we have had these massive corrections, but in conjunction with that, we've also had reduction in hiring, less spending on corporate and personal levels. Some of the stuff is showing up in the commodity prices softening a little bit. So, I think in the near term, we get that range bound volatility, but investors that, have been waiting for something might be thinking, we can't call the bottom here, but is it possible that the market has done some of the work for the Fed? And is it possible that putting that first dollar to work makes sense here?
Sylvia, are we still in a dynamic where the Fed is almost rewarded, I would say, or seen as doing its job if the markets drop? The idea here being that the Fed put, that's been, I think, a staple of the markets for, let's call it 2 years, since March 2020, the evaporation of that Fed put, is that still the badge of honor that it perhaps was 3-4 months ago?
Great question, and I think that there's been more of a separation now, which is perhaps what the Fed wanted. But I feel like another way to look at it is to say that in terms of that last inflation number coming in and the Fed acting with 75 bips and starting to see the easing in things like job demand softening a little bit, commodities softening a little bit. We haven't seen it in the numbers yet, but if you sort of look at it day by day, it is starting to tick a little bit lower. And all three, indices pulling back in a major way. Markets again tend to do some of the work for the Fed. So I think that the market is sort of pricing in that the economy is perhaps on its way into a small recession, a large recession, some sort of correction. So to that effect, I think, we might be close to an end, at least in pain, in terms of the amount of frost that has been taken off of the market.
Sylvia, one of the many reasons we like chatting with you is you oftentimes disclose kind of what you're doing in the market. And I see here in your notes that you bought some Delta stock. Now, that can't be because the smooth travel we're experiencing here in the U.S. this summer. Is this, just a really leveraged reopening play for you?
Yeah, it's probably a terrible experience to fly the friendly skies these days. But what I think is interesting about the airlines is if you look at the TSA numbers, we heard a report today that this weekend was essentially a record in terms of travel. So, and we've also seen the data and the numbers in terms of consumer spending sort of lightened up in the area of goods, and it went over to services, and they've had this 30% plus level of inflation, in the parentheses / price appreciation that they have been able to price on to the consumer. So I think that, to your point, it's a good way to put it. It's a sort of a levered bet on the reopen trade that I think is going to pay off in the next couple of earnings reports. And, the Delta CEO came on and said that they're seeing it, right? They're almost back to pre-pandemic levels. Some days they had higher bookings than pre-pandemic levels, and they increased their operating margin outlook and increased their sort of revenue outlook. So I think that in terms of sort of where do you go now, it's a price that's certainly been hammered enough, but it's got some upside in the short term. So I did dabble in Delta as well as some semiconductors and tech.
Well, speaking of semiconductors in particular, Paul and I were discussing a story earlier of the U.S. dissuading or trying to dissuade ASML, the Dutch semiconductor maker, to give some of their technology, some of their really sought after machine making technology, your secrets, basically, for chips, to China. Sorry, I'm losing my words here, but basically this is such a complicated story. And it kind of seems like there's this narrative still going on in the background of the Biden administration trying to bring on some of that chip capacity back into the States and away from China. Squared the chip story, the inflationary story, with the geopolitics of it all for us.
Yeah, so I think in terms of what's going on in terms of bringing chip production factories onshore, I think that if I look far out, because I just think that will take a really long time to actually play out, that ends up being a win for companies like Intel, for example. But in terms of just sort of separating that and geopolitics, I just look at semiconductors as almost consumer staples in terms of our future innovation technology, whether it's 5G, whether it's electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, machine learning, metaverse, Web3. your new coffee maker, whatever it might be. It
Right.
all requires a chip. And I just think that, 50% hit to a lot of these names that have loads of cash. Look at NVIDIA. I mean, loads of cash on the balance sheet, well-run companies. They're good places to be. I think it just takes time to get, performance back.
All right, Sylvia, good stuff. We always appreciate chatting with you. Sylvia Jablonski, Chief Investment Officer, Defiance ETFs, joining us on the phone from New York City here. Coming up next, it is Beyond the Bell, our cross-platform coverage of the market close with our colleagues from Bloomberg Television. You're going to want to catch that because it has been a crazy intraday volatility is how I'll phrase it across many asset classes. We're going to tie it together for you in just moments. This is Bloomberg.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
About 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day, Caroline Hyde, Taylor Riggs, Katie Greifeld, counting you down to the closing bell, here to help us take Beyond the Bell, the global simulcast. Kriti Gupta, Paul Sweeney, bringing together Bloomberg TV, radio, YouTube. As always, we really try and dissect what has been a change of tack for the market. We started off with risk aversion and managed to push on higher, Kriti.
Yeah, Caroline, what's interesting is what the driving forces actually are, because Paul and I were discussing this on radio just a few minutes ago. If you had gone and looked at the market at 9 a.m. this morning, tech was the underperformer, commodities was the outperformer. To see complete turnaround, to me, at least on the surface, Paul, suggests that this isn't a market that's worried about recession fears on the surface. There's a lot more going on here, specifically perhaps who's actually participating in this market.
I'll tell you, one of the benefits of being on air pretty much all market day is you get to see how the market evolves throughout the day. And this morning coming in, it was all about the strong dollar. It was all about the weakness of the European currencies, concern about a recession there, concern about a global recession. And now that narrative is kind of turned on its head a little bit, and we've got some of the growthier names really strong today.
I was going to say, Katie could argue with you, Paul, about who was on air earlier. I think she started at 5 a.m.
This isn't a competition anyone wants to win.
No more of a competition. Talk to me, Katie, though, about sort of the lack of volatility that we see, the calmness that pervades within a little bit of the equity market, but bond yields might be telling you a little bit something different when you look at the MOVE index and some of the bond volatility.
Absolutely. I mean, the divergence between bond volatility and equity volatility has been really interesting. We've been talking about that really subdued VIX. Not the case when you look at some of the bond market volatility.
No, certainly not. And we look at that market as we've got 10 seconds until the closing bell, and they start to ring, Blue Apron ringing the closing bell on one particular exchange. And we have some optimism on the S&P 500 at least, just 6 points of optimism as we see these markets settle. We're up 6.2 points. That's basically 0.2% higher on the S&P 500. Notable considering the sell-off had been to the tune of more than a percentage point on the downside. 3,832 is where we end the day's trade. NASDAQ really has been your outperformer throughout the day. 194 points to the upside, 1.75% higher. Meanwhile, the Dow Jones Industrial Average still underwater. Of course, energy stocks really feeling the pain today. We're off by 129 points, 0.4% to the down. The Russell 2000 small caps managing to power on higher from significant sell-offs around 10 a.m. Managed to close out the day more than 0.7% higher.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me because as we talk also about what is moving higher, we got to talk about what the hedge is, what actually works in this market. Paul and I were once again discussing, we've been nerding out a lot on radio, I have to admit, about this commodity story, Katie, simply that was the trade that's been working. It's the macro hedge to go to, but it's also the trade that's most vulnerable to that recession risk. So as we talk about recession, something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that energy trade has been working for a long time, not so much today. If you take a look at the sector level, what's losing? You have energy way down at the bottom of the pack, and it's been a topsy-turvy day, but this has been the case since about 11 a.m. or so something to rely on. You also have utilities leading the losses as well. If you look at what is working, you have media and entertainment stocks leading the broad indexes out of the doldrums. That's Meta, that's Alphabet, some of your social media stocks, also retailers and consumer durables as well, catching a bid, Paul.
Yeah, Katie, as a former TMT analyst myself, I pay attention to those names, and it's nice to see, or it's interesting to see some of those big names that have the big top-line growth stories, like a Facebook, like a Meta, like a PayPal, all outperforming well today. Just goes to show you that investors today were just looking for some good old-fashioned top-line growth.
Yeah, and let's talk about the exact opposite of that trade, which is, of course, the commodities trade. Paul, that was the outperformer this morning. Once again, I'm going to keep hammering this idea because if you actually look on a macro level, commodities are down 9-10% at their lows today, even bigger of a margin than what you saw during the trade war. This is a really big deal when we talk about those growth fears, and it's translating into the stock market by names like ExxonMobil, Halliburton, Freeport-McMoran. That commodities trade, these are all movers that are to the downside, all movers that are weighing the entire S&P 500 down.
Kriti, and I can show that exact reflection. If we go cross-asset for our radio audience, I'm looking at commodities, just a complete vertical of red when you're looking at global macro movers. Brent crude off by more than 9%. Worst trading day for oil in 3 months. We have WTI of more than 8% below that $100 level. $99.69 is where we've been. Interestingly, gasoline have been pulling back from that record high that we've been seeing, but some of the metals, copper at a 19-month low. And interestingly, when we talk about where the haven is, it ain't gold. Gold has been at a 6-month low as well. Why? Because US dollar is really where your haven is. I'm looking at the Bloomberg Dollar Index. Higher strengthening, we're seeing it up about a percentage point. Therefore, what's weakening against the US dollar? The Canadian dollar, the loonie, obviously, as oil pushes back. We see the Danish kroner, some of those FX pairs that really highlight what is happening in the commodities market has been lower. But really, euro has been one of the key focuses for the market. When we're seeing it weakening by 1.5 percentage points, we're seeing it $1.03. No wonder the talk about dollar parity is really becoming the narrative, and indeed the worries about the European overall economy. What that means in terms of the face of the recession, that's why we got the bid for havens. Netherlands, their yields down 19 basis points on the 2-year. German debt getting a real bid on as well. Portuguese, Belgium, and indeed the UK gilt market on fire today, Taylor.
You really saw that again here within the U.S. Yields ended lower, but not as low as they were earlier this morning. But I think what's really caught my attention, as you can see there, the 2, the 5, and the 10-year yield are all at about a 282. So it's sort of signaling to you, again, the flatness of that yield curve. You get a little bit of a lift up, a little bit higher going out at 20s and at 30s. You're still only down about 2 to 4 basis points or so on the day, but yields are definitely a little bit higher. So you're still not looking at a full inversion, though that sort of inversion in the recessionary words, Paul, are certainly something that we've been talking a lot about today.
All right, well, Tom Keene is not here, so we can talk a little crypto here. I just want to throw crypto in there because when you talk volatility, you have to talk crypto. Bitcoin up 3.1% right now. Still, remember, it trades all the time, and it's just over $20,300. So a little bit of a lift to crypto today, but it's kind of been trading right or near that 20,000 level for a long time.
You know, it's really funny. I don't know. My whole family is obsessed with crypto. So to come off July 4th weekend just talking about crypto constantly, it's up, it's down, but it's always at 20,000. Right. It's really kind of remarkable how it's really established this very firm range at that key level.
But as many would say, once again, this is about, well, the correlations that it still has with the NASDAQ. NASDAQ pushes higher, so too does crypto. And once again, we don't see it as a diversified trade in any way. It does seem to move very much as a risk asset as we speak.
Well, speaking of correlations, Caroline, let's talk about, I think, what the driver is of this particular market, at least year to date. I mean, remember, just about a year ago, we were talking about this correlation between Bitcoin and tech. We were talking about this correlation between rates and tech in particular. And it kind of seems like the correlations, or at least the driver of the domino effect we're seeing in the markets, at least year to date, has been the currency story. What do you do in a stronger dollar environment, even when the dollar gets stronger and stronger, despite yields perhaps coming down like today, Taylor?
And Paul, maybe we punt this to you, because it was Mohamed El-Arian, I think in his Bloomberg opinion piece this morning, talking about some of the silver linings in the market. One of those is that correlations are behaving as they should be. We're also speaking with Diana Amoa here, saying earlier that the way that bonds were not behaving in the first quarter, at least they're starting to finally act like a safe haven once again. And it's a return to those traditional correlations that are giving a sigh of relief here.
Yeah, it's Kriti and I were just talking about the 60-40 portfolio. A lot of people have been writing off the 60-40 portfolio. We're 60% in stocks, 40% in bonds, and that just wasn't working for you this year. But maybe getting a little bit back to normal here as these markets try to discount what's coming up.
My other hot take, other than earnings seasons never ends, it feels like the 60-40 portfolio never will truly die. Certainly, it seems to always come back. And as history shows, it probably will.
Yeah, don't fight against history. Don't fight against the Fed as well at the moment. It would feel we're all waiting with bated breath for those Fed minutes out as soon as tomorrow. The JOLTS numbers as well, the labor data, all of this going to paint the picture of what the reaction function to the Federal Reserve really is going to be.
That payrolls data, I mean, a massive emphasis really needed on that, simply as we talk about what the actual, how much really room there is to actually move in this economy, or is this a lost cause when we're dealing with an extremely tight labor market? Is it recession or nothing, Taylor?
Okay, I did my research. I know last time I was mentioning how many times inflation was mentioned in the earnings calls. According to that same report, recession was now mentioned, Paul, 29 times. That was up from 2 the previous quarter.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to hear this quarter, if we want to just kind of preview a little bit, recession, I think we'll hear that, and I think we're going to hear about the dollar and translations, and the question is, are analysts going to look through those translation effects in the net income, or is that going to be an issue for earnings estimates?
But isn't it better at least that, remember Microsoft, right? At least cutting forecasts since due to a strong dollar, but at least it's not something fundamental. Does that give us sort of any reprieve here as you think about the fundamentals of the bottom line?
I feel like companies might actually use the strong dollar as sort of an excuse, maybe if they miss on a few metrics. I know that Microsoft news did raise some eyebrows back a few weeks ago when that broke.
Yeah, Microsoft, Nike, Starbucks, McDonald's, you name it, the list goes on and on. This is perhaps the pros and cons of being an American multinational company in the era of a strong bringback. Well, that does it for our cross-platform coverage of the market close on Bloomberg Television, Radio, and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, same place.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, you're listening to Bloomberg Business Week Radio on Bloomberg Radio. Carol Messer, Tim Stenovic, they are out today. Kriti Gupta and Paul Sweeney with you here, getting you through. We just got the close of this market, and again, the S&P, believe it or not, up 0.6% after being down. 0.1% after being down 2 full percentage points earlier in the day. Just some type of intraday volatility is what the traders tell me.
Yeah, and I think we were just talking to our Bloomberg TV colleagues. It is wild to witness this kind of market when you have a non-traditional correlations at play here. I mean, we were talking about FX this morning. Now we're talking about commodities. And we're also talking about a defensive play. In the last 6 months, has tech even been that defensive play?
No, it's been beaten up, but some folks coming back to tech in a big way today. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. World and National News with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. The 21-year-old person of interest in yesterday's Highland Park parade shooting pre-planned the attack for several weeks. That's the word from Lake County Deputy Chief Chris Cavelli, who says the suspect, Bobby Cremo, also donned a disguise.
During the attack, Cremo was dressed in women's clothing, and investigators do believe he did this to conceal his facial tattoos and his identity and help him during the escape with the other people who were fleeing the chaos.
Deputy Chief Chris Cavelli says it also appears the gun used in the attack was bought legally. The death toll has risen to 7. Dozens of others were wounded by the shooter, who was firing from the top of a downtown building. The Georgia prosecutor investigating the conduct of former President Donald Trump and his allies after the 2020 election is trying to compel U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham and former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani to testify before a special grand jury. Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis today filed subpoena petitions with the judge overseeing the special grand jury. Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's cabinet is in flux right now after a variety of scandals. We hear the latest from Bloomberg's Roz Matheson in London.
2 very big names in his government are quitting, and that's the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, who was, of course, previously in the Treasury, and now, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. 2 big supporters of Boris Johnson, 2 big members of his cabinet, going within minutes of each other, tweeting that they feel that they've lost confidence in Boris Johnson as a leader.
Again, Bloomberg's Roz Matheson reporting. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries.
All right, Kriti, here's a story right after my heart. The chief executive officers of major beer makers are asking U.S. President Joe Biden to suspend aluminum tariffs that have cost the industry more than $1.4 billion since 2018. Get this, the beer industry uses more than 41 billion aluminum cans annually. That's according to a Beer Institute letter to the White House dated July 1st. That's a lot of aluminum.
Why didn't we talk about this when we were talking about the Chinese
I know.
tariffs?
I
This
know.
is
We
so handy.
tie it all in.
We really could have. But, I think it's so crucial when we're talking about packaging in particular. Paul, in a former life, I used to do equity research for hedge funds, outsourced. And one of the companies I had looked into was a packaging company. They made, cardboard and packing peanuts and things like that. And the amount of things I know about cardboard fibers, first off, is unreal. And second,
good to know.
If you ever need a fun fact. But the second thing I didn't realize is that a lot of that packaging material does actually come from abroad. You don't get it here in the States, which is interesting because when you're talking about things like packaging material, like beer cans, for example, you don't get that from here. So you have to first bring in the packaging, put in the product, and then re-export it back out.
Really, that sounds
like a lot of work.
Inefficient.
Right?
But, I mean, if you're a brewery, I mean, I guess when those aluminum tariffs hit, but, I mean, aluminum is a commodity. So it trades kind of however, supply and demand, that kind of thing. So I'm looking at aluminum here. LME aluminum year to date, it's down 15%. So just, the underlying commodity of aluminum is down, but I guess there's still those pesky little tariffs on there.
Yeah, and let's throw in the Russia invasion into Ukraine into that as well, because a lot of that aluminum comes from Russia in particular. And there was a time a couple months ago when a lot of these companies had to say, well, okay, we gotta rethink our strategy in terms of sourcing those particular raw materials, something that car makers have to do too with their use of aluminum.
All right, beer makers, aluminum cans, 41 billion. That's a lot of aluminum. So we'll have to keep an eye on that story. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pelletot. Massive reversal on Wall Street with the S&P 500 index eking out a modest gain after falling as much as 2.2%. The S&P end of the day 6 points higher, up by 0.2%. Those gains coming in the final hour of trading and into the close. The Dow, though, had a loss today, down 129 points, down 0.4%. Nasdaq up 194, a gain of 1.8%. 10-year up 13.30 seconds, 10-year yield 2.83%. Spot gold down $40 the ounce to $17.67, a drop there of 2.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude, big story today, plunging 8.1% on WTI, down $8.81 a barrel to $99.62. Bitcoin up 4.2% now, $20,581 on Bitcoin. Recapping, S&P ends the day with a gain, up 6 points, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelletot. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelletot, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Bloomberg Business Week today is brought to you by Informatica. In the cloud, your data has the power to do the extraordinary. Manage data across any location in the cloud for accurate and actionable insights. More at Informatica.com. All right, it is the week after July 4th, Critty, and in my world of media, that means the Allen & Company conference out at somewhere like Sun Valley, Idaho, something like that. It's really, really cool. The media moguls, they get together, they all come in on their jets, and there's literally not enough space in the airport there for all of their jets, and they do deals, they talk business. Ed Ludlow's there. He's a West Coast correspondent for Bloomberg News. He is on the phone from Sun Valley, Idaho. I think I know the bush he's hiding behind to pounce on that unsuspecting CEO for that spot interview. Ed, what can you tell us about Sun Valley, Idaho here as we get ready for the Allen & Company conference?
Well, it's here. It's happening, you know, nice. And a lot of the people that we expect to hear from are walking right by me. You know, we've seen Bob Iger, we've seen Warren Buffett. Just had a little chat with Warner Discovery CEO David Zaslav, you know, and he kind of set the tone of the week that this is an industry, right? It's traditionally a telecoms and media event. This is an industry, he said, that is in turmoil, but he sees a lot of opportunity, and he sees a lot of experimentation from competitors like Netflix. He's thinking about his own brands, and you know, I'm just curious about what these executives, billionaires, moguls, whatever you want to call them, are talking about behind the closed doors, not just to me.
You know, Paul, we had on Bloomberg Television earlier, we had a bump shot, or essentially a quick picture of Sun Valley, Idaho. I did not realize how pretty
extraordinary.
It's stunning.
Fantastic.
It's stunning. Ed, I'm so jealous of this assignment. It's
right.
It is really pretty. Side note, that's not the question I'm going to ask you, but I just had to point out, I was really stunned. I was like, when people think Idaho, you don't think.
Well, what's funny, like most Western resorts, when you go out there skiing, every lift operator, every bellboy, every bartender says, oh, but it's even better in the summer. You got to come back. And they weren't kidding.
I mean, it looked like a little slice of heaven. But Ed, I have to ask about the subject matter here because, I mean, you know me, I'm a markets gal. So we are talking about recession. We're talking about a crunch. We're talking about, you know, the end of the strength of the American consumer. Are people in Sun Valley worried about that?
They are, and many of these people are chief executives or executives of publicly traded companies in industries that have suffered. You know, you look at some of these stocks on a year-to-date basis, they're feeling a lot of pain. Netflix, this time last year, Ted Sanderos and Reed Hastings were flying high, right? Netflix was the pandemic darling. They were the people that everyone wanted to speak to. This year, David Zaslav has the crown, right, as the kind of industry king, if you want to put it that way. Netflix is under pressure. And then there's also the awkwardness in the room, literally. You have Elon Musk on the list. We believe he'll attend. You also have Twitter's CEO and CFO due to attend. Well, surely they're going to talk about the deal for Elon Musk to buy Twitter. And if they're not, surely people that pass them in the corridors of this resort, out in the mountains and on the mountain bike trails, they'll talk about it, surely.
So, Ed, this Allen & Company conference, it's famous as a spawning ground, if you will, for big M&A in the media. Now the technology, all that kind of space. What's the expectation here for, you know, maybe some deal making?
I think we see a mixed picture in deals, right? You think about some of the huge deals we've had, Elon Musk's bid to buy Twitter, the Microsoft Activision deal, all of these came after last year's Sun Valley, right? Allen & Co., if you look at the deals they're involved in an advisory capacity, their name is against them. And the full expectation, I'm told, is that there will be conversations here that either give birth to new deals. I would also say, that this is a reflective industry, an industry that's looking at itself and thinking, how do we be competitive? The story of the pandemic wasn't that just streaming hit a height. It was that media content streaming, there were many more players that were birthed and evolved. And, that brings the word consolidation to mind to me, right? Every consumer has so much option right now. Do we really need all these streaming platforms? I bet, Paul, you have every single one. I also have every single one, but there does come a point with a recessionary environment where you have to look at your spending and think, which one can I give up?
I've done this duty out at Sun Valley several years ago for Bloomberg, and part of the chore, Critty, is to make sure you are out and about socializing in the evening in Sun Valley's bars and restaurants, and you never know who you're going to run into. So, Ed, have you got that planned out? Do you have a strategy for the after hours part of your job?
Yeah, what bar are you hitting?
Yeah. Well, I'm a great believer in early bird gets the worm, but also being the night owl. And, I will be up at 4 or 5 a.m. trying to catch those poor, unsuspecting executives out on their morning jog. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. And I will be in the bars tonight, but I'll limit, the number of beverages I'm having because I'm working. I'm staying on task. And sometimes people, they want to talk. They do have something they want to say.
What's the big theme this year? Is there a big theme like maybe streaming was last year?
I think that streaming will still be a theme. I think that it's an industry that's looking at how it can evolve content. Look at what happened with CNN Plus and the rethink that's had to happen there. But I also do think that now we get much more of a macro conversation. Remember, this is an Allen & Co. event where they all gather in rooms, they hear big picture presentations. We seldom find what these presentations are about because the attendees are not allowed to discuss them. But often they are a global look at the world, at the markets, the economy, healthcare. And these are some of the conversations we'll be having here as well.
All right, good stuff. Ed, I highly recommend, if you have a couple hours free sometime during this trip, head over to Bald Mountain, the ski resort there at Sun Valley. Take the chairlift up to the top. Spectacular views, some great hiking up there, and it's right there, so some cool stuff. Take advantage of it. Ed Ludlow, West Coast correspondent, Bloomberg News, on the phone from Sun Valley, Idaho, the Allen & Company Media Mogul Conference. I mean, everybody's there. Tech, telecom, you name it, they're all there talking to each other, maybe even doing some deals. We'll see. This is Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130. To Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 99.1. To Boston, Bloomberg 106.1. To San Francisco, Bloomberg 960. To the country, Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
All right, coming up in our next half hour, we're going to check in with Liz Elting. She's a founder and chief executive officer for the Elizabeth Elting Foundation. Talk about getting women funded, getting women into the business world and supporting them going forward. It's a big focus of her, and we'll dig into that. That's coming up right now. Let's go to Charlie Pellet for a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. What a turnaround today on Wall Street, with the S&P 500 index ending the day with a gain of 6 points, up by about 0.2%. S&P turning positive really in the final 30 minutes of trading. Again, ending the day higher by 6, have been down 83, dropping as much as 2.2%. Stocks moved higher today, eking out a modest gain as easing energy prices and bond yields took pressure off of higher valuation shares. The Dow was down 129, down 0.4. NASDAQ up 194, up by about 1.8%. 10-year up 15.30 seconds, 10-year yield 2.82%. Spot gold down $42 the ounce to $17.66. A drop of 2.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 8.1%, 99.64 a barrel on WTI. Now, what about the overall market backdrop? Sylvia Jablonski is Chief Investment Officer at Defiance ETFs, and she was our guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
I think in the near term we get that range-bound volatility, but investors that have been waiting for something might be thinking, we can't call the bottom here, but is it possible that the market has done some of the work for the Fed? And is it possible that putting that first dollar to work makes sense here?
Tesla investors have a lot to parse after the July 4th holiday, a disappointing quarter of deliveries, a record month of production, and now several weeks of downtime at multiple plants. The electric car maker will halt most production on its Model Y assembly line in Shanghai for the first 2 weeks of July, then stop the Model 3 line for a 20-day stretch starting on July 18th. Tesla shares did advance today, up by 2.5%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. I'm going to bring on our next guest right away, Liz Elting, founder and chief executive officer of the Elizabeth Elting Foundation, joins us on the phone from New York City. Liz, thanks so much for joining us here. Talk to us about what you and your foundation are doing.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I was an entrepreneur for 26 years. And then I sold my company, or my half of my company, in 2018. And I fully committed myself to philanthropy and advocacy through my foundation. And really what our mission is to lift up women and other marginalized populations and underserved communities through a variety of initiatives. And we do it in business, everything from business to public health, to education, to venture funds and scholarships, and even mentoring women directly in business. So it's all really about helping women and other marginalized communities succeed in business.
Well, talk to us about how you do that exactly, because it seems like, you mentioned the scholarships, the grants. Walk us through the funding of all of that.
Sure. Well, we do everything, as you just mentioned, from creating scholarship opportunities for entrepreneurial young women to funding exciting women-led startups and social entrepreneurs, to supporting women-led organizations which are out there that are fostering women's success through educational programs, mentorship, community building, and more. And just to give some examples of what I just said, is, for example, I'm very involved in NYU Business School's Stern's Endless Frontier Labs, which is a terrific accelerator program, which is there for many entrepreneurs each year who apply. And these are entrepreneurs ages 25 to 75 in the tech area and life sciences area. And every year I fund the two best, the two award-winning from the competition women-led enterprises that I think make the most sense. So right there, I do that every year. That's very exciting, and there's some wonderful entrepreneurs involved in that. And what the foundation does, as I said, it provides capital to these women-led early-stage science and tech startups. And the reason that this is so important is because women founders have far less access to venture capital and even bank loans, as we know, both of which get boosted by existing relationships with investors or lenders that women entrepreneurs are less likely to have. So if I can start by being an investor, then other investors will join on. There'll be follow-on investors. Another way in which
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, another way in which I do this is through the American Heart Association's Bernard J. Tyson Social Impact Fund, which was started by Bernard J. Tyson, former CEO of Kaiser Permanente, and that was to fund social entrepreneurs. And what they do is they fund on-the-ground social organizations tackling systemic barriers to equality for women and other marginalized communities. And now I'm actually launching the Elizabeth Elting Fund to do the same thing, to fund social entrepreneurs. So that's another way in which we do this. There's another organization I'm involved with funding, or my foundation is called Bob Blue, which is a great, basically it's a business organization / club in Detroit. And what they do is they provide mentorship to entrepreneurs and education and networking opportunities. They foster inclusivity and community, and they help women build the financial and management skills needed to run a successful business. So these are some of the things the foundation does. I also speak about entrepreneurship and support women at NYU Business School, Columbia Business School, Trinity College, and I'm now starting to invest directly in other entrepreneurs, other women-led companies, women who I've met who are terrific entrepreneurs with wonderful business ideas. So that's some of what I'm doing.
So Liz, just real quickly before we go to break, and we'll have you back in the next segment. Just are women underrepresented in terms of the entrepreneurial ranks?
Unfortunately, they still are. And the statistics are changing, but I think unfortunately what happened with COVID is the numbers went down. And because women unfortunately needed to be at home to deal with the remote school and all of those other issues. So unfortunately they are underrepresented in what I do when I give my business advice and how women can deal with these issues is I give them advice on how to start companies and how to make them successful, because we need more women entrepreneurs out there. When they're out there, they tend to be extremely successful the same way when they're at the top ranks of business. The businesses are very successful. So I definitely am working on encouraging more women to be entrepreneurs.
All right, Liz, you're going to stick around. We'll chat with you on the other side of this break here. We'll learn some more about your foundation and helping women in the world of business and funding and so on. Liz Elting, founder and chief executive officer of the Elizabeth Elting Foundation. She's on the phone from New York City with us, and we'll get back to her in just a moment. Again, look, just to give you a close on these markets, S&P actually turned positive, up 1/10%. All right, right now let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. Police say the alleged shooter at yesterday's Independence Day parade north of Chicago planned the incident over many weeks. Authorities say a seventh person has died. Dozens of others were wounded when shots were fired from a rooftop. Lake County Deputy Chief Chris Cavelli says the suspect, Bobby Cremo, wore a disguise that helped him leave the parade undetected.
Cremo exited the roof, he dropped his rifle, and he blended in with the crowd, and he escaped.
Deputy Chief Cavelli says Cremo fled to his mother's house, which was near where the shooting took place, and he then borrowed her car. He was eventually pulled over by police and arrested. President Biden presided over a ceremony today awarding the Medal of Honor to 4 soldiers, one posthumously, who fought a half a century ago in Vietnam.
The president recounted their acts of heroism, fighting on despite their wounds when ambushed by overwhelming enemy force.
We're setting the record straight. We're upgrading the awards of 4 soldiers who performed acts of incredible heroism during the Vietnam conflict. I mean, it's just astounding what each of them have done.
The president said these 4 men were added to the Medal of Honor roll after a reevaluation of heroic actions by Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians, and one of the honorees was a Cherokee Native American. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
Rudy Giuliani, Senator Lindsey Graham, and 5 others have apparently been called to testify before a special grand jury in Atlanta. as part of an investigation into attempts by then-President Donald Trump and his supporters to change the results of the 2020 election. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, looking at oil here today. WTI crude oil off 8.1%, just below $100 a barrel. Got my attention because Warren Buffett, he keeps snapping up Occidental Petroleum stock when the stock drops below 60. He obviously likes what he sees in his oil business.
And remember, Warren Buffett, there's some history here, Paul, helped finance the Anadarko acquisition back in the day. I want to call this pre-pandemic. And he kind of said that this expansion that Occidental has going into just creating a bigger and bigger presence within the United States, Anadarko a key part of that. He did help finance that loan that Vicky Holub then used to buy Anadarko. So to see him kind of not only help with the M&A of that, but then also buy more shares of it, it's quite the vote of confidence.
It is. I mean, it's an interesting time to be investing in global energy, like in in Occidental Petroleum, because you've got the world to some degree, to varying degrees, trying to go green.
Yeah.
Some of the European energy companies probably farther along and more committed to it than some of the U.S. companies. But then you have $120, $130 oil, and you've got no refining capacity to turn that into diesel or gas that people need every day. And then you start saying, boy, I need my old energy companies back. I need those refineries down on the Gulf Coast to be cranking again. So it's a difficult time to be investing there because, there's a lot of cross currents. But when you see Warren Buffett continue to make investments there and selectively adding whenever the stock pulls back, that's a pretty interesting vote of confidence, I think.
Yeah, and remember that if going green doesn't necessarily mean eliminating oil altogether. There's oil in everything, in Vaseline, in the plastic in our toothbrushes, in the rubber of our soles. There will still be oil need to some extent. And even if you're looking at it from a price perspective, JP Morgan, Paul said this morning that it could go in their most bullish scenario up to $380. Citi, on the other hand, saying 65 is their bear case.
Yep, Bloomberg reporting that Berkshire stake is now 17.4% of Oxy's common shares outstanding. That's a commitment.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story out of the United Kingdom. Nadhim Zahawi has been named Chancellor of the Exchequer in Boris Johnson's UK government after Rishi Sunak quit the post in protest at his leadership earlier today. Johnson's office is confirming the appointment in an emailed statement. Treasuries rallied today as talks of easing tariffs on China imposed by the former administration failed to alleviate recession fears. Commodities from oil to copper remained under pressure as the dollar rose. West Texas Intermediate crude dropped 8.1% today. WTI below $100 a barrel at $99.65, dropping today by $8.78 a barrel. Gold down 2.3%, lower by $42 the ounce to $17.66. The 10-year yield 2.80%. S&P had a 6-point gain, have been down as many as 83 points, but ended the session with a gain of just about 0.2%. The Dow down 129, down 0.4. NASDAQ again higher by 1.8%. Recapping, S&P advanced 6 points, up by 0.2. Big reversal today. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Good stuff there. I want to continue our conversation with Liz Elting. Liz is the founder and chief executive officer of the Elizabeth Elting Foundation. She joins us on the phone from New York City. Liz, thanks so much for sticking around. I want to talk about women in business, but particularly, kind of in the more senior levels, because what I've, observed during my career is, when you see an incoming class of investment banking analysts coming out of college or people, going to a law firm, a new class of lawyers, it seems pretty representative by gender, by race. Yet when it comes time for the promotion to partner, managing director, boy, it's no longer representative there. How do you think about that?
No, you're right. Absolutely. And we certainly need to do everything we can to change that. And I think there's certainly more of an effort being made than there was in the past, but we need to do a whole lot more. I think we need, at the hiring level, I think you're right. It comes in about 50-50. We need to continue to have, as I'm starting to see at these big financial institutions and Fortune 500 companies, organizations set up for women, women leadership groups to keep women in the game, to encourage them to stay, and then of course to support them through marriage and then motherhood, and to set it up so it's conducive to having kids and having a career at the same time, and then of course quotas if that's what it takes, because we know when we have women in those roles, companies do at least as well, if not better. So we need to have these groups. We need to have systems within the companies, and then of course there's the whole issue with the government. We need systemic changes in our world. Obviously, I think the Roe v. Wade thing. You didn't ask me about politics, but we need to set it up so women can stay in the workforce through motherhood, and that has to do with what the government does, and maternity leave and paid maternity leave. I think most big companies are doing it, but we need it across the board, and paternity leave, and then of course within companies, as I said, the groups, and then of course at the C-level and the board level.
And Liz, I'm wondering, just with the pandemic and remote work, it seems to be the new way to work, to have, you work a few days at home or maybe work all the time at home. I would think that would be helpful to some women, maybe some entrepreneurs that, need greater flexibility perhaps.
I suppose it could be, depending upon what these women are doing, right? Because I think if their businesses operate in such a way that it's about results, and the results and the work can take place at night or on weekends or whenever works for them, yes. But I think it depends so much on the situation. So yes, it can be helpful for sure.
You mentioned in your first answer about quotas, and I'm curious because quotas and kind of this diversity mandate can come with some mixed reception. And I'm curious about what you would say to someone who says, well, if you have a quota and you have this need for a woman, and perhaps that woman isn't of the same caliber as their counterpart, what would you say to that? And I'm going to note this with the fact that I am a woman, and I do face these issues, but that is sometimes seems to be the response to the idea of quotas.
Right, Creedy, and I agree with what you're saying. I used to say the same thing, and believe me, when I went to business school, I didn't even get involved in Stern Women in Business because I thought, why do we need that? It's all about performance. We don't need things set up for women. But by the same token, I'm seeing, and I've seen from my many years of experience, that we do, and I do believe with quotas, we will find at least as qualified, at least as capable and talented women as we do men. It'd be one thing if we didn't, and if we didn't, then yes, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think that's what tends to be the case. We know in undergrad programs and in grad school programs, there are just as many women. Actually, there are more in undergrad programs. I know in business school programs we don't have enough, and we need to get more women in business school programs. But the point is, there are more women getting their college degrees and their advanced degrees, and there are plenty of smart, capable, talented women. If there aren't, if we couldn't find them, I would agree with you. But I don't think it'll be a problem, to find those with quotas, and I don't think it is a problem.
No, Liz, I'm completely with you. In fact, I had the same experience in college. I started doing investing in a college club that was purely for women. Actually, I owe arguably owe my entire career to one girl in particular there. But, I also have to ask simply about how this has a ripple effect in terms of things like feeder schools, for example, or these programs and connecting them to top-tier banks or top-tier businesses or top-tier grad schools. How do you help make those connections?
Right. So are you saying basically if there's a feeder school that, a top business school that is then supplying the talent to a top tier financial institution, how do we get more women in the business school? Is that what you're saying? Yes. I mean, and I know that we at NYU Business School, I'm on the board of NYU Business School, we work on it. We want more. We try to bring in more women all the time to Stern, both undergraduate and graduate, and that's why, in addition to the Endless Frontier Labs, which I mentioned that I fund 2 women-led companies a year, I also fund 4 MBA scholarships a year. So we work hard on bringing women in. Sometimes women can't do it because they don't have the financial resources, or they don't want to take. There are different reasons, and so that's the point of our working on bringing more women into these programs. And I think that's very important. So absolutely, we need to continue to do that.
All right, Liz, great stuff. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us and your experiences. Liz Elting, founder and chief executive officer of the Elizabeth Elting Foundation, joining us on the phone from New York City. And what a crazy day here, Creedy. I mean, just from the trading perspective, the volatility that we saw intraday to the news coming out of the UK about some of the resignations, very high-level members of Boris Johnson's cabinet there. So just lots of news flow for global markets.
Yeah, can I just say it's been a pleasure to witness it all with you.
Sure.
From sunrise to sunset, it seems. This is fascinating because I'm curious about how much of this kind of ripple effect we see tomorrow, specifically with the UK political situation. Now that you're starting to see more cabinets, how many European investors are going to be processing this tomorrow? And again, what are the ripple effects? The ripple effect today started in Europe, weaker euro, stronger dollar, and had kind of this domino effect to the S&P 500. Do we see the same thing again tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. Another, I'm sure, interesting day. And, of course, Bloomberg has it for you 24/7 around the clock from around the world. Just extraordinary coverage. Bloomberg News never sleeps, I guess. This could be the
Neither do we.
Exactly right. So we'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.